The text came in at 3:14 in the morning, which I know because I was still awake, which I was not going to admit to anyone, least of all her. It said, "Can I ask you something I've never asked anyone?" I read it twice. I set my phone on my chest and looked at the ceiling. I picked it up and read it again. It still said what it said. The sender was still who it was, Kara Novak, who sat 11 feet across from me in an open plan office, who had been my professional counterpart and occasional thorn for the better part of 3 years, who argued with me about project direction and methodology, and once, memorably, about the correct way to present a data set to a non-technical client, with a precision that suggested the argument had been personal long before it became professional. Kara Novak, who I had spent 3 years treating like a problem to be managed and thinking about in a frequency I would not have described out loud. I typed yes. I deleted it. I typed, of course. I deleted that too. I typed, "It's 3 a.m. Kara," and sent that one, because it was honest and it bought me a moment to understand what was happening. She replied in 40 seconds. She said, "I know. I wasn't going to text." And then I did. I said, "Ask it." She said, "Not yet." She said, "Are you actually awake, or did I wake you?" I said, "I was awake." She said, "Why?" I said, "I could ask you the same thing." She said, "I asked first." She had. She always did. That was the problem, or one of them. My name is Seth Callahan. I am 35 years old. I work as a senior strategist at a mid-sized brand consultancy, which means I spend my days solving problems that other people have named incorrectly, and my evenings occasionally questioning whether I named them right. I live in a flat with a kitchen I actually use, and a balcony I use more, and I am, by professional reputation, calm, focused, and difficult to rattle. This reputation is largely accurate. It has one exception. That exception has sat 11 feet away from me for 3 years and just texted me at 3:14 in the morning. Kara Novak was 32. She was a senior strategist too, which was the first of our several structural problems. Same title, same team, different enough approaches that our overlap produced either very good work or very pointed conversations, with not much in between. She was precise where I was instinctive. She wanted evidence where I wanted momentum. We had been dropped into the same projects with the cheerful optimism of management who believed that complementary styles meant harmonious collaboration, which is the kind of thing you believe before you have watched 2 people spend 40 minutes in a glass-walled meeting room disagreeing about the word choice on a single slide. She had dark hair she wore back when she was concentrating and down when she had already decided something. I had learned this distinction approximately 4 months into working alongside her and had been noticing it ever since without meaning to. She had a yellow legal pad she wrote on in meetings instead of using the laptop like everyone else, which she had defended to me once by saying she thought better in handwriting. And I had said that was statistically unsupported, and she had said so is most of what you call instinct, and we had reached an impasse that had felt, in retrospect, less like a disagreement and more like a very inefficient form of paying attention to each other. She was the first person I looked for when I walked into the office. I had decided this was a professional habit, the way you orient to a rival in a room, because rivals require monitoring. I had been deciding this for 2.5 years. I was less certain than I had been at the start. I said I was awake because I had a thought about the Whitmore brief that I couldn't let go. She said, "Which part?" I said, "The positioning section. The framing feels off, and I can't locate where." She said, "The second paragraph. The language assumes familiarity the audience doesn't have yet." She paused. She said, "I made a note about it today, but I didn't send it, because we've been doing that thing again." I said, "What thing?" She said, The thing where we're careful with each other. The professional version, where we copy each other on emails and use complete sentences and don't say things the direct way. The ceiling was very interesting at 3:21 in the morning. I said, "When did we start doing that?" She said, "About 2 months ago, after the Mercer presentation." I said something I shouldn't have in the debrief, and you went quiet in a way that wasn't your usual quiet, and after that we've been doing the careful thing. I said, "What did you think my usual quiet was?" She said, "Thinking. Your thinking quiet is different from your bothered quiet." I know the difference. I said nothing for a moment. Outside, the street was the particular silence of a city at 3 in the morning, which is not actual silence, but its own specific frequency. I said, "What do you want to ask me, Kara?" She said, "I'm working up to it." I said, "It's been 20 minutes. She said, "Some questions take 20 minutes. I said, "Fair enough." She did not say anything for long enough that I started to think the conversation had ended. Then she said, "Do you think we would have been different if we hadn't been rivals first?" I read it twice. I set my phone on my chest again. I picked it up. I said, "Define different." She said, "You know what I mean." I said, "I want to hear your version." She said, "Seth." I said, "I mean it. Your version." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think we would have gotten to things faster. I think we would have skipped the part where we turned every conversation into a referendum on who was right. I think I would have said certain things a long time ago, and you might have said them back, and we wouldn't be here at 3 in the morning talking around what we're actually talking about." Something in my chest shifted. Not dramatically, just with the particular weight of something that has been waiting to shift for longer than it should have. I said, "What are we actually talking about?" She said, "I think you know." I said, "I want to hear it." She said, "That's very annoying." I said, "I know." She said, "You always make me say the thing." I said, "Because you say it better than I do." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, quieter than the rest of the conversation, "I have been trying to be your rival." Because it was the only framework I had that made sense of how much I was paying attention to you. And I think I've been using it past its usefulness. I think it stopped making sense a while ago, and I kept using it anyway, because the alternative was admitting something I wasn't sure was returnable. I said, "Returnable." She said, "If I said it and you didn't, if it went the wrong way, we still have to sit 11 feet apart on Monday. I have poor risk tolerance for certain things. This is one of them." I said, "You have never shown poor risk tolerance for anything in your professional life." She said, "This isn't professional." I said, "No, it isn't." She said, "Seth." She said it in the specific register she used when she had already made a decision and was waiting to see if I had caught up. She said, "I texted you at 3 in the morning. Because I was lying awake thinking about the Whitmore brief too, and I thought about calling you, and then I thought about why I wanted to call you, and then I thought about the last 2 months of Careful, and I decided that I was done with Careful." I said, "What does done with Careful look like?" She said, This is what it looks like. Texting you at 3 and when I should be asleep and telling you that I look for you first when I walk into the office and the yellow legal pad is because I genuinely think better in handwriting, but I also know you find it interesting, and I have been, without fully admitting it, doing it slightly more deliberately in your presence than I would have otherwise. I said, "You have been deliberately handwriting at me." She said, "It sounds less calculated when it's not stated directly." I said, "How long?" She said, "About a year. Probably longer." She paused. She said, "Can I ask the thing now? The actual thing?" I said, You've been asking it for 30 minutes. She said, the direct version. I said, ask it. She said, do you think about me the way I think about you? The room did something quiet. The city's 3M frequency did its thing. I looked at the ceiling and then at my phone. And then I typed the thing I had been not saying for approximately 2.5 years, which was, yes. And I have been calling it professional friction for so long that I genuinely did not notice when it became something else. Which is embarrassing for someone who is supposed to be good at identifying what things actually are. She said nothing for long enough that I counted 20 seconds. Then she said, that's the most self-aware thing you've ever texted me. I said, I have my moments. She said, the Mercer debrief. What I said. I told you the Hartley approach was smarter. In front of the whole team. I said, it landed. She said, I said it because I was angry about something else entirely, and you were the available target, and it was wrong, and I've been trying to find a way to say that for 2 months. I said, what were you angry about? She said, I had just realized I was in fairly significant trouble with regard to my feelings about you, and it felt more manageable to be in an argument. I said, that is a catastrophically inefficient coping strategy. She said, I know, I have better ones usually. I said, what's your best one? She said, apparently, texting people at 3 in the morning. I said, that one is working reasonably well. She said, yes. She paused. She said, I don't know what to do with this. Professionally, we are still going to sit 11 feet apart on Monday, and someone is going to be wrong about something, and we are going to have to disagree about it in a room with glass walls. I said, we're good at that part. She said, we are. She paused. I'd like to be good at the other part too. I said, me too. She said, this is very strange. I said, it is. She said, I'm glad I texted. I said, I'm glad you were awake. She said, were you really thinking about the Whitmore brief? I said, yes, and other things. She said, what other things? I said, you know what other things. She said, I want your version. I said, that's very annoying. She said, I know. She paused. She said, tell me anyway. I said, I was thinking about the last 2 months of Careful, and whether I had made it worse by not saying anything. I was thinking about the Mercer debrief and what you actually meant, and whether I was reading it right. I was thinking about the legal pad. I said, I think about the legal pad more than is warranted. She said, the legal pad is just a legal pad. I said, I know. I think about it anyway. She said, oh. She said it quietly, in the way that meant something had landed in a way she was still processing. She said, okay. I said, okay. Neither of us said anything for a moment that was different from the earlier silences. This one had a different texture. Less waiting, more settling. She said, I should try to sleep. I said, probably. She said, we're going to have to be normal on Monday. I said, we will be terrible at that. She said, absolutely terrible. She paused. She said, Seth. I said, yeah. She said, I'm going to say goodnight now. But this isn't finished. I said, I know. She said, good. She said goodnight. I put my phone on my nightstand and looked at the ceiling for another 20 minutes, which is the appropriate response to a conversation that rearranges things. We were terrible at normal on Monday, which I had predicted accurately. She walked in and I looked for her, which I always had, except now I was not pretending it was professional surveillance. She sat down and opened her legal pad and did not look at me for approximately 4 minutes, which I counted. And then she looked up and said, second paragraph, Whitmore, the language. Fix it before the 11 o'clock. I said, already on it. She said, good. She looked back at her pad. I looked at my screen. We were both smiling at the things in front of us, which two people do when they are pretending not to be aware of each other, and are in fact extremely aware of each other, and which is a terrible secret to keep in an office with glass walls. We had coffee that Thursday, at a place off the main road, not the office one, which was a distinction we both understood without discussing. She brought the legal pad, which I had expected. She ordered first, which she always did. We talked about the Whitmore brief for 20 minutes, and then, at some point, we stopped talking about the Whitmore brief, and she said, I've never texted anyone something like that before. And I said, I know. And she said, how do you know? And I said, because you said so. In the text. And she said, right. And then she looked at me across the table in the way she looked at things she had decided were true. 6 months later, the glass-walled room arguments were exactly the same. She was still precise where I was instinctive. She still wanted evidence where I wanted momentum. She still wrote on the yellow legal pad instead of the laptop. I still looked for her first when I walked into a room, except now I did not pretend it was monitoring. 2 years later, when people asked how it started, I said it started at 3 in the morning with a question she had been building to for 30 minutes. She said it started long before that, and I had simply been the last to put the correct name on it. I said, I'm a strategist. Naming things correctly is my job. She said, you named this one about 2 years late. I said that was fair. She said it was accurate. Both things were true. Nothing about us had changed where it mattered. She still argued better than anyone I knew. I still found the argument the most interesting part of any room she was in. The only difference was that now we did not have to route it through a professional framework to make it make sense. It had probably always been her. 11 feet across an open plan office. Yellow legal pad. Dark hair down when she had already decided something. I had just needed her to text me at 3 in the morning and refused to be careful about it for the first time in 2.5 years. What would you have done if your work rival texted you at 3 a.m. and asked you something they'd never asked anyone? And have you ever mistaken the most important thing in your life for a professional problem, kept it at arm's length with the wrong name on it until someone finally made you look at it directly? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.